Welcome to Season 6, Episode 1 of the EFL Magazine podcast. Today's guest is Barry O'Callaghan. Barry is an Irish financier who serves as Executive Chairman of Aclo Capital, his private investment vehicle. Aclo controls operating assets in the area of international education, hospitality and real estate. Previously, Barry served as chairman and CEO of Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, a leading global education company, and as CEO of its predecessor company, Riverdeep Interactive Learning. Barry remains the chairman and CEO of Rise Global, the successor education company to HMH and a leading ELT company with operations in Asia and headquarters in Seoul, Korea.
Hey everyone, buckle up for a new episode of the EFL Magazine Business Podcast, the one and only podcast made to help you launch your business or take your existing business to a level of success you could never have imagined. Whether you're a school owner, freelancer, publisher, or other entrepreneur, you're sure to pick up lots of actionable advice when you listen to the EFL Magazine Business Podcast. Remember to visit eflmagazine.com for great articles and features. Without further ado, here's your host, the founder of EFL Magazine, Philip Pound.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the latest episode of the EFL Business Podcast, EFL Magazine Business Podcast, or as we've renamed it, the EFL Magazine Podcast. And today I'm delighted to have Barry O'Callaghan. And I just want to, from the Irish Independent 2007, just a introduction to Barry. I hope he doesn't mind. I've taken a few vignettes from an article. Said Barry is a corporate financier, one of the Irish business stories of the past decade, Ireland's youngest billionaire and seriously rich. That's what it says in the article. Is that a kind painting of you, Barry, or?
Swiss, and then in my late 20s, early 30s, got the opportunity to get involved in what was then a very small little Irish startup. Obviously at a very different time in the world of capital markets. So this was back in 99 when, the internet .com boom was booming, and frankly, anything that had .com at the end of it was a potential business plan that could be funded. And obviously, everything online was going to rule the world, much of which has proven out to be true, by the way. But I got involved in a little company then called Riverdeep, and initially got involved kind of as the finance guy, and then quickly found myself with the reins and took it public. And therein began my education journey, which is ongoing 24 years later.
Great. So I just want to go back a bit because this is really the meat and drink of the podcast. I think what you've already mentioned is just want to go back to your school days in Clongowes Woods and Clongowes Wood, is it, or Woods?
Clongowes Wood College, yeah.
Yeah, Clongowes Wood College, and some of the famous past pupils from there. I was just looking at the Wikipedia page while preparing for the podcast, and James Joyce, Thomas Francis Meagher. Some viewers may not be familiar with Thomas Francis Meagher. I think he was one of the first governors of Montana, wasn't he? And also,
the immortal Irishman, as he was known.
That's right. Yeah, I read the book a few years ago, I think. So it's a fact. Oh, there you are. You have it. Yeah. So what did you take away from learning about Thomas Francis Meagher?
Well, I think he's not necessarily from a Jesuitical perspective Clongowes' finest graduate, because obviously he was a serial offender legally and found himself, fleeing from the law over his life. But what I took from it, and certainly from reading the book, was a fascinating character who wasn't afraid to take risk and understood the consequences of taking risk, but was a very principled man and believed in what he stood for. So. While that may not necessarily have aligned with the Jesuit views of the time nor now, he believed in what he believed in, and he stood by his principles and acted out accordingly. So I think there was a lot to admire about the immortal Irishman. James Joyce, actually, is interesting you say about James Joyce. James Joyce is again one of Clongowes' most famous graduates, although famously hated it so much that he dedicated a chapter in the book, The Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, to how miserable his time was in Clongowes. So again, not sure he was he was Clongo's happiest graduate. But I mean, obviously, one of our true iconic literary greats. Although obviously, I've ended up living his life outside of Ireland, not in Ireland.
That's right. And as an exile, we'll come on to that. And it's a Portrait of an Artist, I think, is my favorite book by Joyce, but it's something I have to revisit. I think it's been 30 years. I still remember.
Yeah, well, if you delve back into it, you'll find a piece on Clongowes. He did not have a happy time there.
I actually he also in Dubliners, I used to work in the Gresham Hotel back in the day. I was working for a summer there, and he said the staff in the Gresham were drunken, stupid louts. So I think he got a dig at everybody. Also, I want to, yeah, sorry.
It's that. Sorry to cut across you, but it sounds like we've another thing in common, as two Irishmen who grew up in rural Ireland. I actually, during college, you asked about my time in Trinity College. I actually, when I was in college, worked throughout my college career in the Shelbourne Hotel. I had a great job. I had a great job working in the functions in the ballroom of the Shelbourne Hotel, and of course had some terrific experiences and plenty of stories to tell. But I'm not sure for this forum. But it was let's put it this way: back in the mid '80s, when nobody in Ireland had any money, at £5 old Irish punts an hour, I was the man to know for the Friday night pints. So it was great.
Yeah, the Shelbourne Bar is a thing of legend among journalists, isn't it, and politicians, where stories.
Exactly, that's the horseshoe bar, the little bar down off the foyer. I worked in the functions down the back, but yeah, I mean the Shelbourne was and still remains an Irish institution, obviously where our constitution was signed, actually.
Yeah, it's a beautiful hotel. I was a member of the gym actually in the Shelbourne Hotel back in the day. So lovely gym, lovely swimming pool as well. And also I scroll down to famous business past pupils. And I did see Barry O'Callaghan there, among others, Michael O'Leary, Tony O'Reilly Jr., Michael Smurfit, and Aidan Heavey. So are you acquainted with any of those guys, and any comments to make on their success in business?
To age myself, I was actually in Clongowes when Tony O'Reilly Senior's twin sons, in fact his older son was there as well, but was a bit ahead of me. So Tony and Gavin were actually a couple of years ahead of me in school, so we would have crossed over. And Michael O'Leary, who certainly is our greatest living Irish corporate executive today. I mean, just an extraordinary man who's created an extraordinary company. I know Michael, not least because actually he's got a son in the same year as my son in Clongowes. So we bump into each other on the side of pitches and doing the Sunday runs when we're doing the laundry run to collect the kids and get the laundry done and all that good domestic stuff. Great guy.
Fantastic.
So I don't know the others you mentioned, but obviously, some very interesting people with huge corporate successes.
Absolutely. Michael Smurfit, you can't go past that, really, can you? And then of course yourself and Michael O'Leary. So Clongowes Wood, what what they say, actually I'm gonna mess up this quote now, but what is it the Jesuits say? They say, give me the boy and I'll show you the man, or show me the boy and I'll give you the man. Which one is it?
That's right. That's close enough, Philip. And their other one is, certainly in Clongowes was drilled into us the kind of the man for others ethos. Look, it's funny you mentioned to me that you're from Roscrea, because actually I was destined to go to Roscrea, because both my grandfathers were in Roscrea. My own father, and in fact many of my uncles on both sides, were in Roscrea, and my eldest brother went to Roscrea. But suffice to say, my eldest brother didn't love Roscrea, nor did Roscrea love my eldest brother, who's, by the way, a very successful professor of intensive medicine now in South Australia. So not sure who was right or wrong there, but in any event, Roscrea was not for him, and so as a result, my older brother and I found ourselves in Clongowes. Up until then, there was no real family history with Clongowes. I had a great 6 years there. I loved it. It suited me and my personality. I was, young, competitive, ambitious, and generally an all-rounder. So I loved sport. I loved rugby and was good at rugby because it played to my aggressive side, and yet I was reasonably academic and loved music and drama. So it kind of gave me a bit of everything. And I do think, forget about me, I think more importantly, I think what Clongowes does offer, which is why my only son chose to go there. I didn't actually push him. I wasn't one of these alumni pushing for my son to follow in my people. You learn, whether you like it or not, you learn compromise, you learn concession, you learn empathy, you learn a lot of the things that you simply cannot survive in a boarding school without. And so I would argue those are things that frankly are life skills that we all need anyway. And to a certain extent, some of those life skills have probably possibly have been lost along the way here in recent times. So no, nothing other than happy memories at Clongowes. Didn't really want to follow in the medical footsteps of my father and my two older brothers. So kind of picked law as a kind of why not, because it's a profession, but it's not medicine. And as I said, at the end of law, the only thing I knew was I didn't want to be a lawyer. So found myself running around in my 20s doing investment banking, but ultimately kind of wanted to do my own thing, which is what I've been now doing for 25 odd years.
So there we go. That's a nice little segue into what we're going to talk about next, which is Riverdeep and HMAs. I know you mentioned a little bit about your work in Morgan Stanley and the dot-com bubble. Wow, the dot-com bubble. That was a crazy time in history, wasn't it? What was your experience of it, and what did you learn from it?
Well, I saw a little bit of it initially from a totally different perspective as a banker and a capital markets guy. And I kind of remember just thinking it was extraordinary, some of these businesses that were being considered for IPOs. I won't bore you with the story, but I do remember going with our head of technology research at Credit Suisse, and we went to see this tech company in Amsterdam. And I mean, literally, we were all standing around what seemed like just an empty warehouse with one little PC sitting on a desk, and yet we were all sitting around talking about how this was going to be, Europe's answer to AOL, which was the dominant ISP, internet service provider at the time in the States. And that's, because they had the name Europe Online, they had that copyrighted and acquired under URL, and they had a business plan, and they had a very plausible lady who was articulating a great story. This was something that could be taken public, and I remember scratching my head, going, "I'm certainly not the senior guy in the room, but I'm a little confused as to how this can be taken to the public markets." In any event, a couple of years later, I found myself having left banking and having, frankly, as early stage of business as that was. And the question for me was, the one thing I knew we needed was capital to be able to expand our plans, because our plans were, we were building some very nice educational software, specifically back then for the US market, and specifically actually for the area of worst academic performance in the US public school system at the time, which was middle school maths. So maths for kids aged kind of 10, 11, 12, 13, which is obviously a very formative period cognitively in a child's pathway. But it was also, they were able to statistically track where particularly girls were disengaging from higher level maths. And so there was this kind of gender gap and this fundamental inequality being caused as a result. And so we built the first Riverdeep module that we built was a middle school math program, which is really our kind of calling card. But of course, when I got involved, I realized A, we didn't have enough content, and B, we didn't have any distribution. So, the first things to do, which was the only thing I knew how to do back then, which was raise a bit of capital, was to raise a bit of capital. So we raised capital privately initially in 99, and then raised a substantial amount of capital in 2000 by going public. And so what were those times like, you ask? Those were crazy times, because I found myself as a 30-year-old or 31-year-old, I guess, a CEO of a company which had generated less than $1 million of organic revenue, and we'd acquired a little business with the money we'd raised privately before we went public. They had a bit more. They had a bunch of science content, which kind of rounded out our maths content, but they also had some revenue and some distribution, i.e., some salespeople. So I think the combined entity had $5 million in revenue, and yet we found ourselves, once we went public, with a $2 billion market capitalization, which we all recognized was artificial. Those were the times back then. But more importantly, with $120 million in the bank. And now, of course, I knew I have the capital to be able to turn this into a proper company, which is very much what we did. We spent. If you want me to tell the story, I will, Philip.
Please
Entirely up
do.
to you. Will I keep
Please do.
will I keep
I
going?
was just struck by what you said. The only thing I could do was raise money. That's not a bad that's not a bad talent to have.
Well, it's a good start, but then of course the question is once you have the piggy bank full, can you actually put it to good use? And I would give us probably a B plus. I mean, we certainly, as did almost any company on the planet. I mean, ironically, Amazon, to put it in perspective, Amazon had just gone public, about a year earlier than us, and wasn't a company much bigger than us, and yet look at what they've become. So there's an example of how you do it. Then probably, I don't know what the stats are, but I would hazard a guess to say the vast majority of companies back then, .com company, like early stage companies that went public back then, didn't actually survive. Certainly, they didn't survive as independent entities. We did, and the reason why I say kind of a B plus for the capital is because we spent most of the capital on content. So we built, like, fundamentally, if you're in the content business and you build good content, you may not always hit your kind of your quarterly, semi-annual, annual budgets and targets and all that stuff, but you're building something with significant residual value. And so what we built back then, using a lot of the money that we raised, was we rounded out a full library of math curriculum. So we didn't cover just middle school; we covered all the way from early stage all the way through to AP, advanced placement, kind of high end calculus, trigonometry, to put it in kind of US parlance, and the fundamental premise was we were using kind of a 3D presentation to teach maths, which oftentimes can be taught much more dynamically using technology than it can in the classroom, because you can let the student actually engage with the content. You can actually, it helps to give them context. So like, take something esoteric like, I don't know, Pythagoras' theorem, and instead of kind of looking at this triangle and try to learn this theorem and trying to understand its relevance, if you actually turn the triangle into a cylinder, into something that can actually, into which you can pour water, you can then actually show how the spatially the theorem works. So it was kind of, it was, I think we pedagogically, from a kind of a pure educational perspective, I think we did something with merit. And then obviously, we found our way to turning that into a business model, which really led to, the whole kind of 10-year evolution of that project. So, took the company public in 2000, raised all the capital, spent a lot of that capital over the course of the next 2 to 3 years. Those 2 to 3 years, we were a public company. Eventually, I took the company private because I felt the kind of whole premise for being public didn't really make sense anymore for the company nor for its shareholders. The shareholders weren't getting the returns they deserved because there was a kind of we were stigmatized as being one of those early stage tech companies that didn't have a future and didn't make money, even though actually we at this point had progressed to making money, because over those 3 years, while building out the product offering and our own distribution channels, we also bought 6 small little software businesses, each of which gave us some sort of ancillary benefit from a product perspective, i.e. more IP, but each one of them was also giving us incremental distribution channels. So, for example, we bought a company called Edmark from IBM, and in the process, we ended up with a global alliance with IBM. We bought a couple of shrink-wrap software businesses that were literally dying in terms of shrink-wrap CDs being sold off the shelves of Walmart. So, a company called The Learning Company and Broderbund. But they had some fantastic value-added resellers and partners, and they also had some great products. So, over the course of the 3 years of being public, we tried to, as best we could, articulate our strategy to the marketplace. Wasn't always easy, and obviously the volatility of the markets to confront with as well. And so eventually, after 3 years as a public company, I took it private with MSD Capital, which is Michael Dell's private equity vehicle at the time, as well as a London-based private equity firm called Alchemy. And then a year and a half later, with the profits of the business, bought them out. And so sort of between 2000 to 2005, it was quite the journey. But what I found over those 5 years is we had built something with, as I said, product efficacy. We had built viable kind of distribution channels. And at this point, myself and my original partner, Pat McDonough, who sadly passed away in December, we now had full control again of a private company. So then it was really, what next? And we'd kind of become as big as we could become in the US without really going head to head with the textbook publishers, and not to get lost with the detail of how kind of budgeting works in the US. Suffice to say, between federal and state and local funding, it gets very complicated. And actually, the way the funding worked in our marketplace was the publishers were actually, even though fundamentally their textbook was designed to do exactly the same thing as our product, they were selling into two different pools of money. And we were kind of selling into these much smaller federal budgets, which were kind of around the edges. But to really grow as a business, I realized we would need to, either partner with or compete against the big textbook publishers. And so again, maybe going back to my kind of corporate finance training, what started as a potential partnership discussion ended up actually in kind of a reverse LBO, where we effectively, using leverage and equity, bought one of the big publishers and reversed our little business, which was only 1/10 the size of the company we bought, into it. So that was 2006, and that's when Houghton, Mifflin, and Riverdeep combined. And what was interesting about that, Philip, was
actually,
again,
just cutting across
sorry,
there.
yeah.
I always thought it was called Houghton, but it's Houghton. There you go. That's
Houghton,
yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Houghton, Mifflin, and back in 2006, the idea was really, Houghton Mifflin had been at one point in time a public company. Then it had been bought by Vivendi. Then it had actually been bought by a consortium of tier one private equity firms, notably Blackstone, TH Lee, and Bain Capital. And I presumed the business obviously has been, owned by very good owners over the last decade. It's no doubt streamlined. So the real industrial logic of putting Riverdeep and Houghton together was, you put technology into the hands of a big sales force that's been historically selling textbooks, and it's going to really give them something extra to sell against their textbook competitors, as well as obviously these are textbook sales guys with deep relationships, and obviously the Houghton brand, a very well respected brand in education in the States. Ironically, it actually proved out to be slightly different in that what we found was actually we felt that there were a lot of costs that we could take out of Houghton Mifflin, because we felt actually they were dabbling, for example, in technology. They didn't need to, because Riverdeep brought all of that to bear, as well as, bluntly, we infused a young, aggressive, largely Irish management team across this enterprise, and we just ran it a bit harder, and so we ended up getting quite a lot of costs out of the business and performing very well. And that was 2006. And then in 2007, a deal not necessarily that we went looking for nor had planned, one of the other textbook publishers actually was put on the market by Reed Elsevier. Reed Elsevier owned a company called Harcourt Brace Yovanovitch, and the thinking at the time, certainly the accepted view at the time, was that you wouldn't get Department of Justice or regulatory approval to be able to put these businesses together. So, i.e., none of the textbook guys would be able to buy each other, because they would end up with too dominant a market share. And so we actually undertook a fairly detailed economic analysis to try and prove out our points that ultimately, whether you had 1 or 10 textbook publishers selling into the marketplace, the states were actually setting the price, not the vendors. So we put forward the argument that it was appropriate for one textbook publisher to buy another textbook publisher. And we initially convinced Reed Elsevier that regulatory risk was manageable. And so as a result, we acquired the asset, and more importantly, we got regulatory approval to close the transaction because the regulators accepted our arguments. And so, fast forward to early 2008, we now had effectively merged the second and fourth largest textbook publishers in the States, together with Riverdeep, which was a consolidation of 8 or 9 different little technology companies, as well as the original products that Riverdeep itself built. And so now you had the clear market leader by almost any metric. To put it in perspective financially, about a $3 billion business making about $1 billion of profit. Yes, we had a lot of debt, about $5 billion of of interest-bearing debt, and then about another 1.5 billion of kind of synthetic debt. But that was no different to the kind of the typical capital structure of deals done at the time. And we had a very robust business, and as I said, we had leadership across almost every category that we were in. And in fact, during the course of 2008, we started to very much leverage our critical mass and our kind of economies of scale to outmuscle the competition. So we actually started to grow our market share. So we actually exceeded all our revenue targets. And then on the cost side, because there was massive cost overlap between the two big publishers, we also exceeded our costs. And I mean, when I look back on my career, it is never fun downsizing. It is never fun to deny somebody of their livelihood. So obviously, putting those businesses together, we had to get rid of a lot of duplicative roles. But as I always reminded people, while we're sorry to say goodbye to people, they'll be exited fairly and with dignity, and paid their full entitlements. But I used to always say to people say, well, you've now won the battle for that seat, and now you've got a seat that's a viable seat for the long term. So make it yours. And so everything was flying in 2008. Cut a long story short, and then obviously the unthinkable happened. Lehman was the symptom, not the cause. But I mean, it took the whole global capital markets down, and in the process, unfortunately, bankrupted a lot of municipalities in the States. So people find it hard to believe that, the state of California, in effect, was bankrupt. But that's what it was. It was insolvent. It's not to say it didn't have assets that couldn't solve its insolvency, but at the time, places like the state of California, and consequently one of my biggest customers, the Department of Education within the state of California, they couldn't pay their bills. So frankly, I ended up with a problem. So
I thought California was always bankrupt. It's been bankrupt a number of times, hasn't it, since?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know what the mismanagement. According to Wikipedia, it says here in 2008, the Great Recession caused U.S. states and California in particular to cut spending on textbooks from EMPG. As education budgets were cut, the company was forced to renegotiate with bondholders. It owed $700 million per year in interest payments from the loan-funded acquisitions. The Houghton Mifflin brand also fell out of favor with many in the literary community after discontinuing some of his contracts with writers. O'Callaghan became the chief CEO of Houghton Mifflin Harcourt in April 2009 after the prior CEO retired. So what happened then?
Yeah, so much of that is true, some isn't. I mean, just to kind of pick one of those now, which is a perfect example of stuff that used to frustrate me at the time. I mean, we didn't fall out of favor. Houghton Mifflin didn't fall out of favor with the literary community. Houghton Mifflin actually, while it's the lion's share of its business for many years has been selling into the education market, its heritage and its history actually is it's the oldest publisher in North America. So. I mean, I remember in my old office in Boston, we had Nathaniel Hawthorne's deck. So, I mean, it is steeped in history. But what we did was, during the restructuring of the global world economy and our little balance sheet in the process, we decided we wouldn't keep, writing bad contracts. So we certainly backed away from advances to authors where you never got a return, but that was kind of the perceived practice. So, I think to say Houghton Mifflin fell out of favor, actually our trade business actually did very well during that period for what it's worth. But in any event, I had obviously been the architect of all these different deals. During 2006 and 2007, while putting Riverdeep, Houghton and Harcourt all together, I had been the executive chairman, and I did have a lovely man working with me at the time called Tony Lucky, who was the CEO. When obviously, the going got tough and we ended up having to restructure the balance sheet and restructure the business, Tony decided to retire and I took the reins as chairman and CEO. And so what I did over the course of 2009 and 10, you'll recall, or maybe you don't, but for those of us who were kind of stuck in the middle of it all, we were obviously all trying to figure out, was this going to be kind of a V-shaped recovery, i.e., in the same way as the world went bust overnight, would it recover overnight because it was just a kind of a synthetic artificial thing, or was it more systemic? And of course, what we all learned was it was systemic. And so it was very much a slow U-shaped recovery, which meant we were never going to be able to just the kind of an expression in banking where you do what's called an amend and extend of your loan agreements. And that sometimes you just pay your creditors a little more money to forbear, it became quite apparent to us that that wasn't going to work here. There was no point in asking our creditors, just give us another 6 months, 12 months of forbearance and all will be fine. I mean, before we went into the recession, 700 million of interest wasn't a problem on $1 billion plus of profits. But obviously, once we went into the recession and our customers couldn't honor their contracts, and we had a largely fixed cost based business, it meant that suddenly the $1 billion plus of profits went to 300 to 400 million of profits, and now we had a problem with our 700 million tax or interest bill. So I, over the course of 2009, did the amend and extend, hoping that the world was going to recover. And then when I realized it wasn't, over the course of 2010, I worked with all of our creditors, from our most senior banks all the way through to our junior unsecured creditors. And I really put forward the same argument to all, which was, putting this company into bankruptcy. It's a fine business with great brands and great people. It's just stuck at the wrong moment in time with the wrong balance sheet. It has too much debt, but by the way, so does the whole world. So we need to restructure our balance sheet, just like governments were. And so the argument I put forward was, as the largest shareholder and controlling shareholder at the time, I understand the rules. I understand the hierarchy of how capital structures work. And so we as the shareholders would do the right and honorable thing, but we would need cooperation from our creditors. And so actually by the end of 2000 sorry, it wasn't the end, actually, it was about the middle of 2010, we ended up, at the time, it was actually the largest ever consensual restructuring done. So we got all of the creditors, across the several different tranches of debt, to agree to reducing the debt dramatically, changing the shareholder splits, and I ceded control to a new group of shareholders, but stayed on as the CEO to work with them, and stayed for a year and then left. Because once I had kind of done my transitional work, I clearly had lost my equity in the business now. Didn't make a whole lot of sense for me to stay working for a bunch of institutions. I mean, I'd left the institutional market 20 years or 15 years previously when I left Credit Suisse. So I didn't kind of go full circle to end up working for them again. So I then left the business in 2011. And when I left, I managed to get, for the original shareholders, the rights to some of Houghton Mifflin Harcourt's backlist of products for territories that they really weren't interested in, and indeed for business models that they weren't interested in. And as well as getting those rights, I also managed to hive off some little startups that we'd set up in Asia. And I then kind of bought out the other shareholders. Once I did that, the new entity called EMPGI was set up, which was the international division, effectively, of what was Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. I then bought out the other shareholders of that and got control of it, and then really started to focus in on how to rebuild my own personal balance sheet, as well as the business that we had at that point in time in Asia. And so therein lies the next chapter, which is we had set up a small little business in China, using some of the same original Riverdeep products that were built for the US classroom to teach middle school maths or early literacy and numeracy. We used those same products to actually found a company called RISE, which actually stands for Riverdeep Immersive Subject English. So RISE was the incarnation or reincarnation, I should say, of the old Riverdeep products delivered in a totally different ELT business model. And so we set up in China, and while we were very unlucky in our timing with the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, we were extremely lucky with, obviously, the growth we enjoyed in China over the course of 10, 11, 12, 13. And we actually sold that business then in 2013 to Bain Capital for 145 million. And obviously that was kind of my financial resurrection, because I owned enough of it for it to be able to kind of allow me to fund my various obligations, as well as to see the kind of the various things I've been doing since. So since then, on the RISE side, we set up RISE Korea. So we sold RISE China, but we kept the IP to be allowed to use outside of Chinese markets. And so we went to Korea and set up a business in Korea, which I can tell you all about, which is now quite a successful, reasonable sized business. We've got like 52 centres and educate about 15,000 kids a year, not just in Greater Seoul, but actually throughout South Korea. And we even actually set up at one point in time a small little business in Japan, Rise Japan. So we met a fantastic guy who was CEO, Yoshi, who was CEO of an IT training business in Japan called Selm. And he was kind of looking to try and create another string to their bow. And so we set up a joint venture where we launched Rise Japan, fully understanding that, ELT can be challenging. English language training can be challenging in Japan. And so we very much tried to approach it with, localizing it for the Japanese needs, but bringing that kind of international expertise, because the program is accredited by Harvard, and, we've worked in partnership with the Johns Hopkins Center for Talented Youth. And obviously it was born out of, the fact that it was all part of the original Houghton Mifflin Harcourt family. So, the way we obviously market these programs is, if you want to learn English from a local, go to a local Hagwon in Korea, or go to a local, learning center in Tokyo. But if you want to learn, English from a native English speaker with a program that's fully accredited, not just a native English speaker who happens to be on a backpacking, trip through Asia and they want to teach English for 6 to 12 months to earn some money. But if you actually want to learn it through an actual program, full taxonomy delivered from A to Z, fully accredited, controlled, personalized, etc. That's the kind of the strength of the RISE program. So we set up in Tokyo. We originally had our first center was in Dakayama. And in fact, we just leased a second center in Setagaya, if I pronounced that correctly. And but we never got to open that because, frankly, COVID pretty much shut that business down. And so since COVID, we actually haven't relaunched the Rise Japan program. And in fact, Selm have subsequently kind of exited and chosen to take their business in a different pathway. So we, meaning my entity, owns the rights in Japan. And so if anybody's listening that's interested, we would be all ears, because we certainly think that what we were proving out pre-COVID was that our program, when deployed properly, and as I said, it's a very prescriptive pathway to teaching English. And it's not just about teaching English, it's about teaching English, but in a contextual manner. So teaching critical thinking, problem solving, the ability to think for oneself as a young child, not just learn endless grammar, without context. And so we thought we were onto something quite successful in Japan pre-COVID. But as I said, that's certainly a market we hope to revisit. Rise is also in Indonesia, Vietnam, Myanmar, Cambodia, certain countries in the Middle East. But by far and away, the biggest footprint we have today within the RISE global family is in Korea, where, as I said, we've got 52 centres. 14 of them we run ourselves. The balance are franchised. We think we can probably grow that number somewhere between 80 to 100 centres. We've also got an online component to that business, which, of course, COVID forced us all to having to figure out anyway. And because our program was fully online, we had first mover advantage in that regard. And it's a private, independently controlled by us, successful business, and we think it's got a great future. And I mean, obviously, the thing I get asked most about my business in Korea is people are reading these headlines about birth rates in Korea, that are amongst the world's lowest within the OECD. And the answer, of course, is yes. The Korean government is spending enormous amounts of money, what appears to date without success, trying to stimulate birth rate growth. But my argument would be we're very much selling into the premium end of the market. So frankly, whether a family has 1 or 2 or 3 children, in terms of disposable income spent on education, historically you can track that. And so I think the future of our business in Korea is actually very, very, very solid. That said, I should say, not to ramble on here, that the one thing I did decide to do after I exited Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, and obviously for over a decade invested myself and my team and all of my own personal capital very much in one big project, I kind of did say to myself, I'm going to try and have the financial discipline as I go through my Renaissance act here, to not get overinvested in just one project and to do multiple things. So what I've really been doing, as well as Rise Global, which, as I said, is really the continuation of Riverdeep Harcourt, Rise China, now Rise Korea, and the other parts making up Rise Global, with the underlying IP that we own. But what I also decided to do was to do other projects. So after I sold the Chinese business, Rise China, in 2013, and I had capital again, I started to invest in other areas. So today
Yep. So just hold that thought, because I'll go through each of those individually, but I just wanted to go back a little bit to what you said about the lingering effects of the 2008, 2009 crash, as we all know, psychologically, but on society as well, and culture and politics, because I just want to refer you or remind you of your Irish Times article of 2019, and you say in the article that so most intelligent people also understand how economic and political systems have disenfranchised billions globally, leading to the populism now threatening the democratic order we had all taken for granted. We will need to embed these two issues of our time at the core of any new curriculum. Would you like to expand on that?
Wow, there's a big question, Philip, in the middle of a podcast. I mean, you could write a thesis. You could write a thesis on that. I suppose, again, it just speaks to kind of context. I think, what's important about modern curriculum is it has to have meaning. So, in fact, in the Irish system, for example, there's been quite a lot of controversy around some of the reforms done. So take maths, for example. They've taken upper level maths and they've tried to reorient it around what they're calling project maths, which is, in theory, a great idea, but in practice, it's got to actually give context, or else it's just an added layer of complexity that confuses kids. And these kids are under enough stress and pressure as it is, because it's all defining high stakes tests that's used as the absolute black line for how you matriculate into university. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is modern curriculum needs to teach more than just its subject matter. It needs to teach it in a holistic context to give kids the motivation to engage with it. I mean, I think we'll all think back to our times in school, and our favorite subjects were probably the ones where we had the best teachers, right? Because the best teacher really got you to engage with that subject matter. So, for example, I had a fantastic Irish teacher. I was not particularly good at Irish, nor did I have some sort of native love of it because I grew up in a Gaeilgeoir family or anything like that. But I really loved Irish because I thought this guy was a fantastic teacher, and he had passion for Gaeilge, and he infused and imbued that passion into his students, and so that's what modern curriculum should aspire to doing. That said, no curriculum, whether it's print-based curriculum or online curriculum or some sort of hybrid, and whether it's infused with AI and all the latest and greatest things that people are now talking about within education as being the game changers. The reality is, no curriculum in and of itself can replace a great teacher. I mean, a great teacher is at the heart of an education ecosystem, and that happens. That holds true primary, secondary, tertiary, and beyond. So great teachers are at the heart of it. But I do think, when you think about curriculum, and we think back to some of the old turgid curriculum that you and I would have had to wade our way through back in the day, you can present that in a much more dynamic way today using all these tools that I'm talking about.
Great. And I didn't want to put you on the spot there, but I just thought it was an interesting observation by, what you had touched on in a little bit earlier. But you did mention, we won't, because the viewers don't have a background, have our background, so critiques of the leaving certificate or whatever. But in the article about Irish education, of course, you do mention a few of these points, but it kind of struck me as well. It's not just later year education, or let's say university entrance exams, for example, or state exams like the leaving certificate. It's actually early years education in Ireland. Because I'm often struck by Americans who I meet here, and when they grew up and went to kindergarten, all these games they knew, and for the first two years of their education life, they were playing games. Of course, we all know Simon Says, but there's like Duck Duck Goose, and they have a whole repertoire of games that they know and they've played. And I think somebody wrote an article in the Irish Times, I think about 6 to 12 months ago, saying exactly the same thing, that in the Irish education system, we didn't get any of this, did we? We were just straight sit at your desk and, you know, listen to me.
Exactly. Kind of what they call kind of theatre style learning, where it's kind of, teacher at the top, students sitting down, yes, miss, yes, mister, yes, Mrs. It's all very kind of compliant and hierarchical. But what I would say to you, Philip, is like it's a long time since you and I've been in that classroom. Things have changed. I mean, you look at, for example, the movement like Educate Together, which is, I mean, for those listening to this who know nothing about Ireland, the very simple history of our education system in Ireland is it was patroned by the church, and 95% of the population were Roman Catholics. So, frankly, Roman Catholics were patrons to 95% of the schools, and the balance were other creeds, but everything was religiously patroned, and a secular, non-denominational movement called Educate Together started back 25 years ago, and they've now got 100 plus schools, and that's very much based upon the kind of constructivism of everybody calls each other respectfully by their first name. They don't teach catechism; they teach ethics. They certainly try to do a lot of the stuff you're talking about in terms of early learning. Trying to, of course, nothing replaces the three R's: reading, the kind of the three R's, which are the fundamentals of literacy and numeracy. But they try and do it in a way that's engaging, that stimulates the kids. That, of course, would stimulate the kids, and then they start to have fun, and they start to learn in spite of themselves. So, and that's very much at the heart of what, for example, our business does, Rise does in China, and latterly in Korea and elsewhere. So look, I mean, like everything else, education has to move with the times. And because education, generally around the world is, it's funded and chartered and governed by the state, right? It tends to move slowly. And ironically, you've probably seen more education reform since COVID than you'd seen in the prior 20, 25 years. So, every now and then, an existential crisis like a pandemic called COVID comes along, and it stimulates people into having to realize, holy heck, there's all this technology available. We don't actually need to be as constrained to the kind of buildings and kind of timetables and kind of traditional methods as we have been. And so, as I said, COVID really was the accelerator and the catalyst to an awful lot of the reform that's happening right now, and which, by the way, has been going on a long time, but hadn't been adopted at a state level, at a national level. But it is now, since COVID. So I think you're seeing a lot more lateral thinking amongst unions, teacher unions across the Western world, that have historically resisted change because they lived through the change of COVID and realized it wasn't necessarily the enemy they thought, and it actually can be an enhancer to their productivity and to their work-life balance rather than, as I said, a threat. So I think you're seeing people, all the stakeholders within education, be it parents, be it governments, be it the unions and the teachers themselves, or ultimately the student themselves. And remember, the student is the one thing for sure is the student is the technology native within all this. The other people may be slightly alien to some of this stuff. They're living it every day. They've got the smartphone, almost at any age. They're playing games. They're doing all these different things, and so to then move that medium into the kind of educational sphere, it's just logical, and it's inevitable as well as logical.
Yeah, I just completely out of the loop. So I just like to move on a little bit, Barry, about you had mentioned secular education, Educate Together in Ireland. And, when doing my research for this podcast, I did come across one of your endeavors, Patheos. Tell me what that's all about.
So Patheos, which I've been out of now for several years, so I don't want to misrepresent what it is today, because I sold that business several years ago. But at the time that we sold it, it was it started its life as kind of initially a religious website for multiple religions, but then actually we ended up with as big so basically a big blogging site, kind of a microblogging site where you could have subject matter experts across all different faiths, including atheism, including agnosticism. So it didn't just have to be people of faith, and it wasn't Christianity versus versus non-Christianity, Islam, etc. It was absolutely diverse across all faith and non-faith based discourse. And then we just had subject matter experts who would write leading articles. It was a free website, but we built a massive kind of engaged community. So we had about 30 million viewers, we realized that it was becoming all wieldy in terms of size and potentially kind of needing to regulate it, which would of course kill the very spirit of what we were trying to do. And so we ultimately ended up selling that business several years ago.
I see. And what was the motivation behind that business?
Yeah, so that's a good example of really back to the point I was trying to make, which was post 2013 and really for the last decade of my life. While whether I like it or not, education has probably become my kind of my subject matter of expertise, and certainly the one I know most about in terms of investing. So obviously I have Rise, but I also set up Ireland's first international school with the world's largest operator of international schools called Nord Anglia. They've got 83 or 84 schools spread across the globe, but we in Ireland, because historically we did have this religiously patroned but quite effective education system, there was never, I suppose, the perception was there was never the need or demand for an international kind of a non-Irish curriculum-based school offering, whereas I felt that really didn't hold true when you look at the size of the FDI investments, foreign direct investment coming into Ireland, the fact that we have basically two economies within the Irish economy. You've got the indigenous economy, and then the foreign economy is basically the same size again. So when you look at kind of all these macroeconomic statistics in Ireland, GNP versus GDP, to really understand what the size of our indigenous economy is, you always have to have the numbers. So that's how important the FDI movement and kind of the big pharma and tech and other companies are in Ireland. I mean, Google, for example, employs 8,000 people, 75% of whom are non-Irish in a massive campus in central Dublin. So, I mean, the Dublin that I grew up in and went to college in has changed completely versus the Dublin of today, and that holds true across the country. And so it was intuitive to me that there was the opportunity to set up an international school, and we did. And in fact, there's probably room for several more. I'm just not sure I'm at the age and stage in my life where I want to do them, but it's been hugely successful. So I still do education as kind of the core of what I do, but I've started to do other things. So to answer your question around Pathos, that was just a friend of a friend introduced me to the opportunity. It looked like a cool little company. I felt like I had the skills to be able to help it, as well as put some capital to work with it. And so we did that and we exited it. So in the same way, I'm doing other things outside of education. So, I've built and bought some hospitality assets in Ireland. So I owned the Cliff House Hotel in Ardmore and the Clifford Lions, which was built by the late Tony Ryan, with just a wonderful old working village appended to a huge estate that he literally rebuilt from scratch. Did the research and the history of how the old working village would have been part of the kind of tenants in common living on the land of this big estate, and he owned the estate, so he rebuilt the village. And when he passed away, I bought it from his family. So I've got education assets and some hotels and bars and gastro pubs and adventure centres and kind of private residences that I run as a hospitality business in Ireland called Cliff. I own a bunch of commercial real estate, which again is a separate discipline and a separate asset class. And then the other project probably that's taking up most of my time beyond the education stuff that I'm kind of actively involved in rather than investing behind is a project called Verde, which is based in the States. We're buying up warehouses and kind of streamlining. I mean, as you'll know, possibly, I'm not sure about your domestic setup, but I live amongst women. I have a wife and three daughters, and during COVID, there was an endless kind of dropping of parcels to my front gate. And it became apparent that there were all these brands that just took off, these kind of small little brands that were niche, took off during COVID. And so we were effectively in the US trying to buy warehouses across the States that service those lesser known brands. And by then having a national footprint of warehouses, you can offer your customers better pricing. So you can service these brands better because they're looking for distribution across the whole of the US. And obviously, you're we're offering the owners of these warehouses some liquidity, and yet they also it's almost like a cooperative. They also join the team. So it's a company called Verde. We've now got warehousing in, I think, 7 different states. A few million square feet of warehousing, and it's still an early project in its infancy, but it's already a kind of $100 million plus business. So that's quite an exciting project. Brings me to the States every kind of 6 or 8 weeks.
That's interesting because a lot of people say that logistically the USA is a very difficult country, and I think a lot of international global companies have had a downfall really in the US, haven't they? I think Tesco tried to expand there, and they came across these difficulties. So what are the particular difficulties of setting up such a business in the US?
Well, I mean, first of all, it starts just the sheer geographic breadth and challenges, in terms of the topography of the place. So you've got the Rockies to contend with. You got the Mississippi, so you've got some big geographic frontiers. It also just speaks to how different the 50 states are, while they all work and plug into the same federal system. I mean, culturally and from a state law perspective, they can be enormously different. So I think you've seen the downfall a lot of times with big international companies that come into the US, because even though it's a very obvious truism, it's a hard thing to manage day to day. Whereas what we're doing is we're doing something from inside the US. So we're effectively, what I'm buying is little businesses that are run by local operators who are experts in their area, in their geography. So, I've managed to put together a great team, which is made up of operators in Rochester, New York, Indianapolis, Boise, Idaho. Most recently we bought a warehousing business run by a fantastic guy in Los Angeles. Very different personalities, very different skill set, but the aggregation of the warehousing obviously gives us competitive pricing and economies of scale, which now mean that we can outmuscle our smaller competitors. So, look, to date, it's going well. We'll see how it goes. I mean, it's a very analog business, right? I mean, this is delivering parcels, the old traditional way. But it's certainly it's an exciting project, and I've assembled a really interesting dynamic group of operators, and I think we've got a big opportunity ahead of us. But no, I don't want to get lost in that particular project. I suppose the real point I'm trying to make to you is just to give you a sense of how do I spend my time. I got to spend my time spread across different sectors, these various projects, some of which I've nothing other than a passive role in, some of which I'm the chief executive of, and as well as I frankly hit my mid-50s, I also try and get work-life balance a little better as well. So, I also don't travel as much as I used to. I also probably don't work as hard as I used to. So it's really, and my kids are getting older. So, in some ways they probably want more of my time rather than less, which seems counterintuitive because you parent very much in a hunter-gatherer provider kind of way when they're younger, whereas actually as they get older, they become your friends. So I hopefully I'm evolving into being a more interesting human being, and I'm getting it largely more right than more wrong, but I'm quite sure it's a mixture of both. My wife would no doubt attest to that.
Great. Well, Barry, it's been a pleasure talking to you today. And if people, you still have, you're winding down a little bit, as you said, more work-life balance. But if people are interested in getting in contact with you, what kind of projects are you looking at partnering?
Sure.
Well, investing.
Well, I think it's speaking to you, Philip. Obviously, running your successful EFL platform in Japan. I'm particularly interested in anybody who's listening to this and thinks that Rise Japan could be, could have a renaissance. So again, just to recap that, we did have 2 centers in Dakayama, and we were going to open up another one. The one in Dakayama was making money and was doing very well, and unfortunately just COVID kind of killed the whole thing operationally. But we have the rights, we have the IP. It's a very bespoke offering, and so it can be relaunched with the right local partner. So if that resonates with anybody, would love to hear from them. But look, I'm reachable by email. I'm not precious. If people email me, I'll certainly email back. So probably the easiest way to get me would be to just email me, BOC, which is obviously my initials, Barry O'Callaghan. So BOC at riseglobal, RISEGLOBAL.IE.
Fantastic. I'll put it in the show notes as well. And great. Barry, thanks again.
Pleasure, Philip. Appreciate the time. Look after yourself.
Thanks for listening to the EFL Magazine Business Podcast with Philip Pound. For more great advice and resources, check out eflmagazine.com. If you found this podcast helpful, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. See you next time.